CEO and CEO of the GSDMA. He held several senior positions such as the Commissioner and Secretary of Rural Development, Commissioner of Information and Secretary to the Chief Minister in Government of Gujarat. He also served as Senior Advisor, Nepal Planning Commission and Senior Advisor, Nepal National Reconstruction Authority following the massive 2015 earthquake that happened in Nepal. In Government of India, he served as Advisor, Policy and Planning in the National Disaster Management Authority, New Delhi. It was in that capacity he addressed us in 2016. He was instrumental in preparing the first ever National Disaster Management Plan. He played a key role in the preparation of several national guidelines such as Guidelines on Minimum Standards of Relief, Guidelines on Preparation of Heat Wave Action Plan, Guidelines on Management of Thunderstorm and Lightning, National Guidelines for Preparation of Action Plan for Cold Wave. He has not spared any area, I would say. Disability, Inclusive Disaster Management and Temporary Shelters, to name a few. He has authored many book chapters and journal articles related to disaster management. He received his PhD in disaster management from the Australian National University, Canberra. Currently, he is the chairman of the Advisory Committee for Mitigation and Management of Floods in Chennai Metro. I am sure you will all agree that we cannot have a better person to give the keynote address today. May I invite Dr. Thirupugal IAS to make his presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him with a warm applause.
The world teacher and philosopher J. Krishnamurti once famously said that if you love your children, there would not be any wars. Had he spoken about disasters instead of wars, he would have said the same thing. If you love your children, there would not be any disasters. If we love our children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren, we would not allow them to be drowned in floods, to be buried under debris, or burnt or roasted alive in chemical and industrial fires. But human beings have the tendency to discount future. Hence the need for frameworks, hence the need for organizing seminars, workshops and discussions to understand prevention and mitigation. See, if you look at this slide, if you look at the total number of occurrences of disasters in the world, USA tops the list, followed by China. Somewhere among the top 10 countries, you will find India also. If you look at the total number of lives lost, among the top 10, you will not find USA. So the total number of lives lost is not related to the total number of occurrences. In this slide, you will find the total economic loss. Again, you find USA topping the list. Somewhere India is also there among the top 10. So all over the world, even in developed countries, though they have been able to reduce the loss of lives, they have not been able to reduce economic losses. We have to understand that. This problem is not only special to India, it is a global problem. You look at Japan, you look at China, you look at USA, economic losses are much more, even though life losses are less. If you analyze the global trend of natural disasters over a period of 180 years, I have to say that this is a slide I have taken from EMDAT. I don't agree with the use of the word natural there. So I will explain why later. If you look at the trend of disasters, you find that disasters are increasing. When compared with 1900, the number of occurrences are increasing. If you look at the granular data, you can see that there is a difference. Hydrometeorological disasters are on the rise, whereas geophysical events have not increased to such an extent. Geophysical events like earthquakes and landslides, whereas cyclones, heavy rains and floods and extreme events have increased. If you look at the total lives lost and compare it with the economic loss, at the global level, we have been able to reduce the loss of lives a great deal. But economic losses are mounting, economic losses are increasing. What does it show? It shows that we have been able to rescue lives, we have improved our early warning search and rescue capacities, but we have not taken adequate prevention and mitigation measures. So the question is it possible to prevent or mitigate disasters? That is the biggest question. Here, I am going to talk about some fundamentals and basic principles. I am not going to talk about techniques and technologies and methods. They keep changing, but the fundamental principles are eternal. Unless we understand the fundamental principles, we will not be able to apply our techniques and methods. So I will focus on the basic principles of risk reduction. First of all, we all have a blueprint for inaction at the individual level, at the household level, society level, community level, and at the government level. We all have a blueprint for inaction when it comes to natural disasters or natural hazards. What is it? First of all, make the problem a natural event. Say that it is a natural disaster. It is a natural event. So what can we do? Often I see political leaders, even bureaucrats, people who are in the field of disaster management saying that natural disasters cannot be avoided or prevented. At the most, we can save lives or provide relief. So the easiest thing is blame it on nature, make the problem a natural event. Second is make the problem which cannot be avoided. How can you avoid floods? How can you avoid earthquakes? So what can we do about it? Third is make the solution seem expensive. It's very costly. How can we afford to do that? But if you look at the quantum of relief we give after the occurrence of the disasters, if the same money would have been spent before the occurrence of the disaster, we would have saved so much of economic loss. Then make it an all or none issue. I'll give an example. In Delhi, if 80% of the building, Delhi is situated in zone 4 for earthquake vulnerability. If 80% of the buildings are non-code compliance buildings, so what we say is 80% of the millions of buildings are not complying with the seismic codes. How can we make all of them safe? So what do? You do nothing. Make it an all or none issue. But if we can prioritize our interventions, select 20% of the buildings where public good is involved, we can reduce 80% of the losses. That we don't do. We make it an all or none issue. Make it an issue where only a policy or act only can be useful. So what we say is, no, the existing policy is not good. We start preparing new policies. Existing act is insufficient. Bring out a stringent act. Then wait for perfection. So we keep on studying the problem. We keep on studying the problems. You would have seen in some of the universities, I have seen, some students will continue to study there forever at the age of 40, 50. They would never come out of the campus to face life. So we keep on studying the problem. And then, this is the worst of all, say that we have already done it. This is my experience. As advisor of the National Disaster Management Authority, as advisor to many countries with regard to disaster management, whenever I go and tell people this is what we should do, the first response would be that we have already done it. We've already done it. That is worse than a disaster, actually. So if you want to solve a problem, as Thiruvalluvar says, Noi Nadi, Noi Mudal Nadi, Adu Thanikum Vaipachayal என்று சொல்லுகிறார் Thiruvalluvar. So unless you study the problem, understand the root cause of the problem, we will not be able to give solutions. But most of the time, we are treating the symptoms, we are not treating the root causes. Where do we take the first step? The first step is understanding what a disaster is. Since we use this word disaster, since you hear it in the television, read it in the newspaper, all of you will have the feeling that we know what a disaster is. But do we all know what a real disaster is? Much action depends on how we define what a disaster is. How this concept of disaster has evolved over a period of time. First, human beings thought that disasters are acts of God. Even today in USA, they use the word act of God. God is punishing the human beings for their sins. Even in 1934, when Nepal Bihar earthquake occurred, Mahatma Gandhi said that it is a punishment given by God for human sins. Every religion has such stories. But in 17th century and 18th century, when the age of enlightenment dawned in Europe, after the Lisbon earthquake in 1755, philosophers like Rousseau and Voltaire questioned this concept of God punishing people. Then, when science also improved, people started understanding that it is not God giving punishments to the human beings. Then they changed the concept. They said, notion of external agent in the form of a natural event is creating the disasters. It may be geophysical events like earthquakes and landslides, or hydrometeorological events, or biological disasters. So if God is punishing, or if a natural event is occurring, how can you prevent it? You can't do anything. So what we have to do is try to save the lives and provide relief. So we adopted a post-disaster reactive approach. Then when anthropologists started studying disasters, they said it is not nature which is creating the disasters, it is the interface of culture and nature which is creating the disasters. All that we have created, whatever human beings have created, is part of the culture. That is why we say agriculture, horticulture, sericulture, everything is culture. So this interface is creating the problem. Nature alone cannot create problems. Then sociologists started studying disasters. They say that disasters are social constructs. It is not God sent. It is not created by nature. It is purely our social structure which is creating the disasters. They say that disasters are social constructs. The notion of social, economic, political and cultural factors are creating the disasters. This is something we should understand. This is the root cause which I was talking about. Our social structure, the class, caste, race and gender divisions in the society. Disasters affect different people differentially. A rich man and a poor man are not affected to the same extent in any disaster anywhere in the world. Poor suffer more in all disasters. In a caste-ridden society like India, certain castes, the so-called lower castes, marginalized communities, they are affected more than others. In the Western countries, it is race. They say that African Americans are more affected. Earlier we used to say black people and Negroes, now African Americans. That itself has a racial connotation. The whites in America are not called European Americans. Why should the blacks be called as African Americans? So the racial division is creating problems there. The so-called African Americans are more affected in disasters. In all disasters, all over the world, regardless of the country being rich or poor, it is women who are more affected in all disasters. Then cultural factors creating disasters. I'll give you one example. It's a very sensitive area. I'll give you one example. In the northeastern India, there is a cultural practice called zoom cultivation. There, they set fire to the forest. Then after the forest burns, they cultivate the land and they do agriculture. Next year, they will go to another area. This is called shifting cultivation or zoom cultivation. I was reading a report recently. In one of the states in northeast, every year an area equivalent to Chennai city is destroyed for zoom cultivation. In addition to this land being destroyed for cultivation, most of the time this results in forest fire destroying a huge area adjoining 2-3 states. So it's a cultural practice. It must have been appropriate before 1,000 years or 2,000 years. Is it relevant now? Then the so-called lower castes and poor forced to occupy unsafe places. We see our settlements in the rural areas. How is the settlement arranged? Certain castes will be in the center safe, and certain, as you go to the margin, you will find certain communities occupying the unsafe places. Mettu kudiyinar. We are using that word in Tamil. Mettil irukiravargal mettu kudiyinar. So, a disaster of the same magnitude impacts different people differentially. This is what we have to understand. And what creates vulnerability? One is the vulnerability of the built environment. We have to understand all the vulnerabilities if you want to make Chennai or any other city disaster resilient. Vulnerability of the built environment, poverty, and I spoke about economic, cultural factors and social factors. I have to talk about economic factors. Our mode of production. Profit-driven society the mode of production only looks at profit, not the damage which we create, and political factors. How political factors create disasters, all of you know much more than me. I need not elaborate on this. Population, economic processes, marginalization, underdevelopment. See, sometimes underdevelopment may create vulnerability. Sometimes overdevelopment, if it is unplanned, it can create vulnerability. And the lack of regulation and enforcement and lack of capacity. All these are. Is there something like a natural disaster? Is there anything like a man-made disasters? There are natural hazards. Earthquakes, flood, heavy rain, cyclones are natural hazards. It is the commissions and omissions done by human beings which convert a hazard into disasters. So there is nothing like a natural disaster. All disasters are man-made disasters. Unless we understand this basically, we will always be blaming nature. The question is how to build a resilient city. Earlier, we used to talk about disaster resilient communities. The original meaning of the word resilience, if you look at the original meaning in the dictionary, it means the ability to bounce back. Now we are using it in a totally different manner. Resilient means not affected by, but that's not the original dictionary meaning. So we spoke about disaster resilient communities, communities which will be able to bounce back in the aftermath of disasters. Then we spoke about disaster resistant communities. Why should they be affected by disasters? Can't they resist disasters? Then we spoke about sustainable hazard mitigation. And finally, we are talking about invulnerable development. That is what we mean by resilience today. Can we develop in such a way we become invulnerable? How do we do it? So far, we have been focusing on relief and saving lives. We have to move towards prevention and mitigation. How do you do that? Sendai framework, which was signed in Japan in 2015 by 187 countries, including India, gives a very good framework for risk mitigation and disaster risk reduction. It gives us 4 priorities. So we have to understand those priorities and act according to those priorities. The first is understanding risk. Unless we understand risk, we will not be able to mitigate it. The second is improving risk governance. Third is investing in risk reduction. It's a very beautiful word. Though we spend money, it is called investment. Why is it called investment? Because if you spend 1 rupee for a disaster risk reduction today, you will be able to save 6 or 7 rupees tomorrow in the form of prevention of loss of lives and economic losses. And lastly, improving early warning, preparedness and building back better. How do you do that? How do you understand risk? Ours is not a risk-sensitive society. This slide needs no explanation. This is an actual photograph taken in one of the Indian cities. Urban, elite, educated, rural, poor, illiterate, both are risk insensitive. This figure is from 2005 to 2015. In the so-called natural hazards, 27,420 people have lost their lives. But in the corresponding period in road accidents, over nearly 14 lakh people lost their lives 510 times. But we are always worried about loss of lives in natural hazards, but we don't talk about these road accidents. Still we find people resisting wearing of helmets or wearing seat belts and drunken driving. We are not a risk-sensitive society. We have to understand this. Why are we not risk-sensitive? Because we take everyday risk. This is a photograph taken from one of the cities in India. So if you are not bothered about everyday risk, how are you going to bother about a risk which will become a reality after 50 years or 100 years? I went to Japan after the 1995 Kobe earthquake. In 2001 I went there. So they showed me the railway station and they told me that, look, this railway station, we very efficiently used this place for people to sleep in the aftermath of the disasters. So they expected me to react saying that what a great thing you have done. I said, you come to India, in every railway station, every day you will find thousands of people sleeping. It's an everyday thing for us. So there is nothing astonishing in what you did. So we take everyday risk. How will we be bothered about a risk which will become a reality after 50 years? So we don't think about long-term risk, we discount long-term risk. There is something called objective risk, the way experts understand risk. That is not going to improve disaster management. What is important is we have to improve how people understand risk, subjective risk. Supposing that one takes a journey from Madras airport to San Francisco, what do you think is the riskiest part of the journey? Which part? Going from here to the airport or flying over oceans and lands for about 7,000-8,000 kilometers, which is the riskiest part of the journey? Which one? Going to the airport. Because road accidents occur 6,000 times more than air accidents. Plane crashes have become almost zero. But a common man will always think that it is safe to travel by car, but it is unsafe to travel by air. So can we change that perception? Not only that, we desire risk. Sigmund Freud rightly said that there are two forces operating in human beings, eros and thanatos, the will for life and will for death. So this is desired risk. We take, we want river view apartments, lake view apartments. We don't bother about the soil condition over there, liquefaction factor over there. We're not bothered about that. Then risk society. Ulrich Beck clearly says that we have built a risk society. The solutions which we have given for our problems have become more riskier than the earlier problems themselves. In this technologically driven society, technology is creating more and more disasters, so we have created a risk society. Can we really live in a zero risk world? It is not possible. Descartes famously said that I think, therefore I am. But we have to say that I risk, therefore I am. We have to accept a certain amount of risk. Living is a process of accepting risk. But the question is, what is acceptable risk? All of us know that sugar is not good for health, so we say half sugar. We don't say no sugar. So, can we define what is the acceptable level of risk which we can understand? Zero risk is not possible. Then what is the level of acceptable risk towards which we have to work? How do you do that? We need to have risk assessments. We have to have hazard risk vulnerability assessments properly. Then we have to undertake microzonation studies and analysis of the past disasters. Losses have to be done. And finally, we have to take into account the impact of climate change in the future. So all this has to be done to understand the nature of risk. That is understanding risk, the first priority. The second is improving risk governance. How do you improve risk governance? Improve the way our institutions function and improve the instruments we have, if it is really required, the legal and regulatory frameworks, and then provide adequate finance, improve our human resources, and build the capacity of the people involved in disaster risk reduction, at the same time build the capacity of the communities themselves. We have to move from response to resilience. That is the biggest challenge now. If we want to do that, to focus on improving the capacity of the local communities. Improving the capacity at the local level is more important, not at the national level, not at the state level. The primary and first responders are the people themselves. The community is the first responder. So can we improve the capacity of the first responders? We need regulations and enforcement. In many places, we don't have regulations, and wherever there are regulations, there is lack of enforcement. So can we improve our enforcement? Question is, regulations, are there too many or too little? Earlier in the earlier slide, I showed that, see, we always think that a policy or act or amending the act is the solution. I always ask this question. The machinery which is not able to implement a liberal act, how is it going to implement a much more stringent act? So by making the act more stringent, by having more regulatory measures, we are not going to improve the regulation. We have to understand that. I feel that the existing regulations are too many. The problem is with implementation only. It is not the inadequacy of laws, it's a question of lack of implementation. Then all or none approach. I feel Pareto's principle applies to risk also. 80% of the risk is concentrated in 20% of the places. Can we select those 20% of the places and focus on them to reduce risk? Whenever there is a major disaster, we think of creating a new institution, an extraordinary mechanism to address that issue. But over the course of time, all these extraordinary mechanisms become ordinary mechanisms because we don't delegate more powers. We don't empower these institutions. The same government staff are deputed, except the name board and the building, nothing is new in this extraordinary mechanism. Can we change this approach? And finally, we should have community-based disaster risk reduction. No government in the world alone will be able to reduce disaster risk. If the risk reduction has to be sustainable, communities have to be involved. The very word sustain, where does it come from? It comes, sub means from below, and tenere means, what I have written? I am not able to read. Hold. So unless something is held from below, it will not be sustainable. So the initiatives should originate from below. It should not come from above. Can people accept schemes and programs and cooperate? That is the benchmark of community-based disaster risk reduction. Finally, improving risk governance means improving ordinary governance, everyday governance. It is not always about crisis. If you don't improve everyday governance, you will not be able to improve disaster risk governance. A person who is not able to walk cannot be expected to sprint. So the best way to improve disaster risk governance is improve everyday governance. How do you do it? Strengthen the state and district level institutions, build local capacities, improve the techno-legal regime, which means focus on implementing the regulations. The third priority is investing in resilience. We have to talk about insurance and risk transfer. The entire risk cannot be absorbed by the government. So we should promote insurance and share the risk. Going beyond sharing it within a district, within a state, within a country, can we think about insurance and reinsurance and share the risk globally? If the risk is shared globally, then it will not be a burden on any government or any individual. Investing in resilience means we have to look beyond the structures. This is very, very important. We always look at structures, building drainage, building a building, creating a dike, creating something. No, we have to look really beyond structures. We have to look at nature-based solutions. We have to improve livelihoods. We have to improve social security. We have to improve access to education and health. We have to improve the human resources, and we have to focus on research and knowledge generation and knowledge sharing. We have to focus on all these things if we want to improve our resilience capacity. We need to improve our response and recovery capacities. If we really want to improve disaster response, there should be coordination among the agencies. This has to be established prior to the occurrence of the disaster, and local response has to be improved. You will be surprised to know countries like Canada and America very clearly say the local communities, the local self-governments cannot expect help from the central authorities before 72 hours. They put it in the policy itself, which means that the local capacity has to be improved and promote voluntarism. In the aftermath of disasters, we see a surge of voluntarism, spontaneous voluntarism. But that sort of untrained spontaneous voluntarism is not going to help. Can we have a cadre of trained volunteers, trained and certified, equipped volunteers, and train the local people, build their capacity? The philosophy should be help yourself. People should be able to help themselves first and help others, and then help others to help themselves. Because continuous help is no help. It is dependency. It's a parasitic relationship. We don't want it. Can people help themselves? Can we aim at that? If we want to do all these things, we have to change our perspective. What is preventing us from doing all these things? The dominant perspective we have. One is we view disasters as isolated events. A disaster occurs, and then after 25 years another disaster will occur, after 30 years another disaster will occur. So we think that there is a development process going on, and it is punctured by these disasters. No. It is wrong. We are accumulating risk on an everyday basis. It can cross a threshold and manifest as a disaster at some point of time, but We are accumulating risk. They are not isolated events. We don't analyze risks, vulnerabilities during normal times. Normal times we are always thinking about development. We always seek solutions in technology. That's how we have created a risk society. Is technology going to solve all the problems? Is more drainage going to solve all the flood problem in Chennai? We have to think about it. See it as a temporary administrative failure. So what do? So we blame a particular political person, or blame a particular bureaucrat, suspend a couple of people, then we are happy. It is not a temporary administrative problem. It's a whole systemic problem we have to understand. We have developed that way for 100 years or 200 years. As I said earlier, the term natural disaster helps. People are seen only as victims. This top-down policies are there. We don't leverage the strength of the people. No accountability, no transparency, and reactive approach. See, this should be the ideal model. When development is the front wheel, and disaster management should be the back wheel, and they should move together. But really, what really happens is, this is the reality model. So can we change this? That is the question. We should have an alternative perspective. What is the alternative perspective we need? One is, we must understand these disasters are part of our normal development process. Normal, unrisk-informed development process. We should understand that. We have to analyze linkages during normal times. Emphasis on solutions that change the relationship and attitude in the society. So unless you don't bring about a fundamental change in the attitude and relationship within the society, then you will not be able to address the root causes. We should look at people as partners, not as beneficiaries. See, sometimes I wonder why we use this word beneficiary. Somebody is affected by flood, somebody is affected by earthquake, somebody is affected by cyclone. We are giving some assistance, whether assistance is given by government or NGO, we use the word beneficiary. No, they are not beneficiaries. Decentralize institutions and empower them to take decisions, improve our transparency and accountability. We have to more proactive approach. Can we look at crisis as an opportunity for social transformation? This is very important. The Chinese word crisis means disaster as well as an opportunity. Every disaster opens a window of opportunity for addressing a range of things which is normally difficult to address during normal times. So in the aftermath of major disasters, can we use the post-disaster window to bring about a real transformation? If we want to do all this, there is need for mainstreaming. So far we have been approaching disaster management through special projects. This is what is called side streaming. Can we bring it as part of the mainstream development process? Mainstreaming cannot be achieved through conferences and workshops. Our disaster management problem is not a technical problem, nor it is a financial problem. It is a political issue. We have to understand that. Mainstreaming needs political will, enforcement of regulations, allocation of funds, and delegation of powers. So can we go for long-term benefits of risk-sensitive development rather than short-term benefits of risk-prone development? Everything is a trade-off. Are we willing to trade off this short-term benefit of non-risk sensitive planning to long-term development of risk-informed planning? That is the question. So mainstreaming, we have to take mainstreaming very, very seriously. When I talk about mainstreaming, it does not mean that today we can stop all special projects and look at mainstreaming totally. No. If you really want to reduce risk, it has two aspects. One is, we should not allow any new risks to accrue from today. For that, mainstreaming will help. But what about the risk which is already accrued? For that, you have to have special projects to mitigate that risk. So for a long time, for 10 years or 20 years, the special projects and mainstreaming should go hand in hand, like exchanging the baton in a relay race, and then only you can switch over to mainstreaming. So I started with a quote from Krishnamurti. I will end it with a quote from Krishnamurti. J.K. used to say that seeing is acting. If you really see, you will act. There will not be any gap between seeing and acting. If you bring in this time factor, I will see, I will understand, I will act, then you are not going to act. So we are all able to see the risk, how we have developed, and what is the result of this risk for development. Now the question is, can we all act? Thank you very much.
Sensitizing all of us, and maybe the rest of the conference will start from here and continue the discussion. We will also share the thoughts from the wider group present here. Thank you so very much for being with us today.